It started with a hiss loud enough to wake me up. At first, I thought it was a snake or maybe some raccoon had knocked over the irrigation box again, but then the pool lights flickered like something was shorting out, and the water gave off this weird steam, as if it had been shocked cold. The real punch came when my phone rang 5 minutes later. It wasn't just my pool that had gone frigid overnight. It was the elementary school down the street, the assisted living home 2 blocks over, and even the fire station's water heating unit. All of them relied on the same discrete geothermal node I'd built quietly under my property. The system had worked perfectly for 3 years, until Karen cut the line because she thought my pool was stealing sunlight from her backyard tiki bar. She had no idea she had just knocked out heat for over 60 homes, including a daycare. The entire neighborhood froze because one HOA Karen had a grudge and a pair of bolt cutters. Just 3 days earlier, everything had been running as smooth as the surface of my water. I'm a systems engineer by trade, so when the city launched a pilot project to test integrated geothermal heating on private properties, I offered up my land. I designed and implemented the node with city permission and approval, routed it through EcoSmart systems, and discreetly connected it to a network that warmed not only my own home and pool but several community spaces. It wasn't public knowledge because the program was in beta, but the results had been incredible. Energy bills for the surrounding houses dropped by 30%. Even Karen, the one woman who had complained non-stop about everything from mailbox placement to seasonal decorations, had unknowingly been benefiting from the system. Karen lived 2 doors down. Platinum blonde, skin leathery from too much tanning, and always in workout gear despite never being seen actually working out. She ran the HOA board like a tiny dictatorship and had once fined a neighbor for having a plastic flamingo in their yard because it was allegedly an eyesore. My existence had always seemed to offend her, though I could never pinpoint exactly why. She would scowl at my solar panels, glare at my compost bin, and once stood outside my gate for 2 hours writing down notes about the way I trimmed my hedge. Last week, she cornered me during garbage day. She asked if I was piping pool heat off the neighborhood grid illegally. I laughed, assuming she was joking. She wasn't. I tried to explain it was the opposite, that I was providing heat. She just narrowed her eyes and said something about getting her own technician to inspect my system for safety violations. That should have tipped me off. Then came the hissing, the frost on the water, and the chaos. I went outside in slippers and a hoodie, following the noise until I found the pipe casing had been forcibly removed and sliced. Not cracked, not corroded, sliced clean like someone had used industrial tools. And as if karma wanted me to have confirmation, I spotted a piece of fabric caught in the landscaping rock, a thread from one of Karen's infamous leopard print tracksuit. I sprinted to check my security camera feeds and, sure enough, there she was, masked like she was starring in a failed Mission Impossible sequel, holding bolt cutters and awkwardly stepping over my garden flamingos. She crouched, clipped the main pool line, looked smug for 2 seconds, and then tripped over a hose and almost face-planted into my begonias. That part was almost funny, until I got the second phone call. This one was from a contact at the local Energy Oversight Board. He was in full panic. He said multiple sensors went offline simultaneously. The automated system kicked in emergency shut-off procedures, which in turn cut heating access to every satellite line connected to my node. Within an hour, social media groups were buzzing. Parents posted about kids shivering at the daycare. Elderly residents were bundling up inside their homes. The fire station had to switch to backup generators for their water heating system. Meanwhile, Karen was posting selfies in front of her cold pool complaining that someone had sabotaged her warmth. I couldn't believe the audacity. She had caused all of this and was acting like the victim. It would have been laughable if people weren't genuinely affected. I sent the footage to the city rep and HOA board within minutes. The response? Radio silence from the HOA. Of course. Karen was the board president. The city rep, however, didn't wait. Within 2 hours, An official warning notice was filed to the HOA for interfering with municipal testing. I could already feel the hurricane building. The next day, Karen marched to my driveway with a smug look and a clipboard. She had the gall to accuse me of siphoning utility resources. I asked her if she'd like to see the footage. She said she didn't need to see fake videos. I said good, because the city had already seen them and would be issuing a formal statement soon. That's when she paused. Her eyes twitched just slightly. She turned on her heel and stormed off, but I knew that was the moment her fantasy started to crack. By midday, the neighborhood group chat was on fire. Someone had leaked the footage, and every homeowner who'd lost heat was asking the same question. What kind of idiot cuts a utility line during a cold front and posts about it like it's a victory? Screenshots of her comments section were circulating faster than she could delete them. One neighbor suggested we make a holiday out of it. Another posted a meme of Karen holding bolt cutters labeled, "Karen the Cold Bringer." But this wasn't just social media shade anymore. The city was furious. Their beta test had been sabotaged and worse, it was traced back to someone with known ties to the HOA. Legal documents were already being drafted, and the city was considering Karen's act as interference with public infrastructure. That came with some very serious implications, especially since the daycare's heat loss had triggered several complaints from parents and even a health inspection warning. I stood by my now silent pool, arms crossed, watching the surface ripple under the cold wind. The irony was surreal. Karen thought she was just ruining my pool day. She didn't know she had unplugged the warmth from an entire community. And now, with the city investigating, neighbors furious, and her face going viral in every HOA gossip circle, she was about to learn what happens when you mess with a quiet engineer who just wanted peace, and built something powerful under everyone's noses. This wasn't over. In fact, it was just heating up. Karen's ability to deny reality would have made a magician jealous. By the time the footage of her midnight sabotage had made the rounds through the neighborhood Facebook group, most people assumed she'd be hiding in shame or at least scrambling to explain herself. But Karen doubled down like it was a championship poker match, and she was holding a winning hand with no card. The very next morning, she had the nerve to hold a clipboard in her driveway, jotting down made-up infractions while telling passers-by that the entire geothermal issue was caused by illegal plumbing coming from my yard. She claimed I was funneling heat from everyone's homes to supercharge my pool and even said she'd uncovered proof of underground heating tunnels. The irony was almost poetic considering she had literally destroyed the very pipe she claimed I was using to steal. I tried reasoning with her. I walked over calmly, footage in hand on my tablet, and gave her one last chance to come clean. I said the city already had the video. I said people were furious, and I wasn't looking to drag her through the legal system, yet. Her response? She laughed in my face. Told me it wouldn't hold up in court because it's your camera, so it's probably AI generated. Then she warned me that if I didn't remove my illegal pool contraption, she'd sue me for endangering the public. I remember blinking slowly, turning around, and deciding in that moment that she wasn't just delusional, she was dangerous. It didn't take long for the rest of the neighborhood to start realizing who was behind the heating blackout. A mom from the daycare posted a clip of her crying toddler wrapped in 3 layers of clothing inside their frigid classroom. Someone else shared a picture of their elderly father sleeping in a coat and beanie indoors. Then came the bombshell. A local bakery that relied on geothermal warmth for their proofing room had to throw away over $1,000 worth of dough. They posted the surveillance image of Karen holding bolt cutters with the caption, "When your croissants freeze," because someone needed drama. The post went viral locally. By the time I returned from the hardware store that afternoon with replacement parts, the HOA email inbox had probably imploded. But the board wasn't doing anything. Why? Because Karen was still their president, and her 2 best friends held the secretary and treasurer positions. They tried to sweep it under the rug by suggesting a community heating inspection, and issued a tone-deaf statement saying homeowners should be careful not to damage neighborhood infrastructure with their unsanctioned improvements. No mention of the footage, the bolt cutters, or the woman now being called the Ice Queen in 4 separate meme threads. That's when I knew I had to escalate things. I called my contact at the city energy department, the same guy who had approved the pilot program. I told him everything: Karen's sabotage, the HOA cover-up, the mounting backlash from residents. Within a few hours, a formal notice from the city landed in the HOA inbox, requiring an emergency investigation. They were sending an inspector out the next morning, and depending on what they found, criminal charges could follow. The notice was also shared publicly, and the reaction was swift. Parents were furious. Business owners were ready to file complaints. Even the fire station, who'd been relying on the geothermal node for hot water, issued a statement condemning the disruption. Karen, of course, had a different strategy. She went to war, digitally. She posted a 12-minute video on her personal page titled, "The Truth About the Neighborhood Heat Scam," in which she stood next to her cold pool and rambled about how my secretive energy system was putting the entire community at risk. She claimed I had buried hazardous pipes without HOA approval, that I was enriching myself through unlicensed energy distribution, and that she heroically stepped in to prevent a catastrophic event. She even referred to herself as a whistleblower. The comments section turned into a battlefield. Half the comments mocked her, calling her the Karen of Winterfell. The other half were from confused relatives and followers asking her what she was talking about and begging her to take the video down before she embarrassed herself further. Meanwhile, my phone didn't stop buzzing. Residents who had previously stayed neutral were now reaching out, apologizing for not seeing the truth sooner. One neighbor who had been suspicious of my technological landscaping came by with a thermos of hot coffee and said, "I thought you were just showing off with all that smart tech. Turns out you were keeping my grandkids warm." The support was nice, but it was also a reminder that Karen's reckless act had touched far more lives than just mine. The city inspector arrived the next morning with 2 assistants and a police escort. They walked through the neighborhood, checked the geothermal access points, and then spent over an hour in my yard reviewing the damages. I handed over everything: the footage, the data logs, the maintenance record. They were impressed with how organized and compliant everything had been. The inspector even said, "To be honest, this setup should be the blueprint for future integrations." Then he asked if I had any known enemies. I didn't even need to answer. Karen was already yelling from her driveway about how the city was in on it too. That afternoon, the city held a community meeting at the local rec center to address the incident. The room was packed. Parents, business owners, retirees. They all showed up, many wrapped in jackets despite the indoor heating. When the city official explained what had happened, and confirmed that the heating failure had been the result of deliberate sabotage, the room erupted. People demanded to know who had done it. The official hesitated for a second, then displayed a still frame from the footage. Karen mid-snip, face half visible, bolt cutters in hand. The silence that followed was deafening. Then came the muttering. And then, a slow but steady rise in pitch as people realized the woman sitting in the 3rd row of folding chairs was the same one in the photo. Karen stood up, tried to say something about editing and CGI, but no one listened. She stormed out of the meeting to a chorus of sarcastic applause. By the next morning, a petition had already started making the rounds to remove her as HOA president. It hit over 70% of resident signatures within 48 hours. Meanwhile, I received an email from the city's legal team confirming that they were preparing to file charges against her for municipal interference, trespassing, and damage to public utility infrastructure. Karen hadn't just picked the wrong person to cross. She had picked the wrong system. And soon, she was going to learn that destroying someone's property out of spite was one thing. But when you destroy something that keeps an entire community warm, the cold you unleash comes back with a vengeance. Karen wasn't done. You'd think after being publicly humiliated, having her sabotage exposed to the entire community, and facing the threat of criminal charges, she'd have the common sense to lie low and maybe, just maybe, issue an apology. But Karen wasn't wired like that. Her instinct when cornered wasn't to retreat. It was to claw her way deeper into delusion. So instead of damage control, she decided to go full rogue. She hired what she called an independent inspection team to survey my backyard, claiming she had documentation proving that I'd buried illegal equipment that posed a danger to the neighborhood. When I checked the credentials of the men she brought in, it turned out they weren't inspectors at all. They were subcontractors from a landscaping firm 3 towns over who had no licenses and no clue what geothermal infrastructure even was. I confronted them as they stepped onto my lawn, holding measuring wheels and a rolled-up blueprint Karen probably drew with crayons. I asked them politely to leave. One of them shrugged and said, "Lady said we could check for gas leaks under the pool." My stomach sank. I knew exactly what she was planning. My geothermal system included a pressure stabilization node that rerouted minor gas releases. Karen had probably seen the word gas somewhere in the utility paperwork and now imagined I had a hidden pipeline ready to explode. I called the city inspector immediately and was told, in no uncertain terms, that tampering with the system again could trigger an emergency lockdown. I barely hung up the phone before it happened. There was a loud metallic clang from the rear corner of my yard, and all 3 of the so-called technicians came running out, one of them yelling that they hit something. Seconds later, an automated siren blared from the utility controller buried beneath the hedges, and my phone lit up with an alert from the emergency response system. Unauthorized access. Pressure drop. Thermal safety lockdown engaged. Within 20 minutes, a fire truck, 2 city repair vans, and a police cruiser were on my street. Karen stood in her driveway with her arms folded, watching it all unfold like she'd just uncovered a major crime ring. She even waved at the fire chief when he stepped out of the truck. I couldn't hear what she said, but the look on his face as he listened said it all. He blinked slowly, turned to the officer beside him, and handed her the clipboard. She walked over to Karen and started reading her Miranda rights. For a second, I thought she was actually going to be cuffed right there. Instead, she started yelling about conspiracies, how I was manipulating the city, how the fire chief was probably on geothermal payroll. She was warned that one more attempt to interfere would result in immediate arrest. At that point, the HOA couldn't stay silent anymore. With dozens of complaints, a media article on the local news website, and videos of Karen's bolt-cutter moment reaching 10,000 views, the remaining board members called an emergency meeting. This time, Karen wasn't allowed to preside. The new interim chair, a retired civil engineer named David, didn't waste time sugarcoating. He began the meeting with a simple sentence: "We all saw what she did, and now we have to clean it up." Residents were given the floor, and one after another, people stood up to describe how Karen's stunt had affected them. A woman described her elderly father being rushed to the hospital due to exposure during the cold snap. A teacher spoke about kids crying in a freezing classroom. The bakery owner explained the thousands of dollars lost in spoiled inventory. The room turned cold in a different way, this time with anger. The board voted to strip Karen of her presidency and bar her from holding any future position. She tried to argue, shouting that it was a setup and she was protecting the community, but no one was listening anymore. She stormed out again, this time to a round of actual applause, not sarcasm. Someone in the back even played the Frozen theme song on their phone. But consequences weren't done knocking on her door. The city issued her a formal notice of civil liability, with an attached invoice for damages totaling over $94,000. That included repair fees, emergency response costs, inspection labor, and financial restitution for 3 separate businesses impacted by the shutdown. If she didn't pay or settle, she'd be taken to court. On top of that, 5 homeowners filed small claims lawsuits for property loss and emotional distress. The daycare center filed a separate civil action citing child endangerment. The fire department submitted a safety complaint accusing her of obstruction during a municipal emergency. Still, Karen refused to believe she had done anything wrong. Her next stunt? Hiring a lawyer and holding a press conference on her lawn. She stood behind a folding table covered in handwritten signs like "Geothermal tyranny ends today" and "No pipes without HOA rights." Her lawyer, a man who looked like he'd been pulled out of a strip mall parking lot, began reading a cease and desist letter demanding that I remove the geothermal system within 72 hours. He used phrases like trespass by thermal reach and unauthorized environmental occupation, none of which made any legal sense. The few neighbors who had wandered over out of curiosity just stood there blinking. One guy whispered, "Is she high?" 2 days later, that same lawyer dropped her as a client when the city's legal team responded with a 25-page packet outlining not only the legality of my setup, but also evidence of Karen's ongoing pattern of harassment and interference. She was slapped with a restraining order preventing her from stepping onto my property or interacting with any part of the geothermal system. The icing on the cake came when the city utility office issued a statement naming my home as the official thermal node for the block, complete with signage and upgraded protections. A sleek new plaque was installed near my pool gate that read "Community Thermal Distribution Node. Do not tamper." Karen had unintentionally made my system permanent, and now it was legally protected. I started receiving thank you notes in my mailbox. One neighbor baked a loaf of banana bread and left it on my porch with a card that said, "Thanks for keeping our pipes warm, even when she was acting cold." Someone else gifted me a custom t-shirt with a picture of bolt cutters crossed out. The support was overwhelming, but more than that, it was vindicating. For years, Karen had made life miserable for everyone on the street. She finally pushed too far, and the fallout was more than just frozen water. It was her credibility, her reputation, and her position. Her house now stood quieter than usual. No more neighborhood patrols. No more clipboards. Just Karen, occasionally peeking through her blinds as people passed her house without a word. Her pool remained empty, her tiki lights unplugged, and the heater she installed now sat broken and rusting, because in her panic, she'd tried tapping into the same utility line she destroyed and fried her own system in the process. For the rest of us, things were finally thawing out. The heat returned not just to the homes, but to the way neighbors spoke to each other. People began organizing community potlucks again. Kids played outside without jackets. The bakery reopened with a grand "thank you" banner that stretched across the front windows. Karen had cut my line thinking it would ruin my pool. Instead, she severed the thin thread holding together the illusion of her control. And now that the neighborhood could finally see her clearly, they weren't going to let her freeze us out again. Karen's downfall had left a cold shadow over her once dominant position in the neighborhood, but I knew better than to assume she was done causing trouble. The restraining order, the lawsuits, the HOA dethroning, none of it would change who she was deep down. Karen wasn't someone who learned lessons. She was someone who simmered in silence until she could find a new way to strike. But this time, I wasn't going to wait around for her next move. I had something else in mind, something that would make her think twice before ever targeting me, or anyone else on the block, again. The moment the city utility office designated my geothermal setup as a protected thermal distribution node, I got to work. What Karen had sabotaged before was already efficient and discreet, but now I had the opportunity, and legal protection, to expand it into something truly extraordinary. With the community's blessing and a bit of extra funding through the city's pilot program, I upgraded the system to include a smart monitoring network, backup battery banks, emergency shutoff relays, and even a thermal defrost unit for the community garden that old Mrs. Pennington had been trying to keep alive. But the best part wasn't the upgrades. It was the opportunity for a bit of theatrical revenge wrapped in utility. I installed a glowing, color-shifting LED system around the pool's edge, just subtle enough not to be tacky, but eye-catching enough to draw stares. The lights pulsed in different patterns depending on the geothermal output levels, and at night, when the steam from the heated water rose into the cold spring air, it created a soft mist that looked almost magical. People started referring to my backyard as the neighborhood spa. Children came over to ask if the water was enchanted. The truth? I didn't mind the attention. I'd built something useful, beautiful, and functional. But what made it all so delicious was that Karen's backyard window faced my pool directly. Every night, she got to watch the community gathering around the one thing she tried to destroy. To celebrate the newly repaired system, I hosted a small get-together. Just close neighbors, a few city officials, and even the head of the local utility board. We served hot cocoa, had a small fire pit going, and let the kids roast marshmallows while adults stood around in light jackets, enjoying the warmth that my system pumped quietly and efficiently across several connected properties. One of the dads leaned over and said, "I gotta admit, I thought you were just one of those quiet tech nerds. But now? You're basically a local superhero." I laughed, thanked him, and looked up to see Karen standing behind her curtains, watching us. A few days later, Karen made her first public reappearance. She had been mostly silent, aside from her short rants posted online that got instantly ratioed by neighbors correcting her nonsense. But this time, she emerged with a cane, though no one remembered her ever having an injury. She marched down the street like she was trying to reclaim territory and handed out leaflets titled, "How to Recognize Property Code Violations in Your Area." The entire block burst out laughing when they saw it. One neighbor laminated it and pinned it to the community bulletin board under a sign that read, "Comedy of the Week." Karen's stunt backfired immediately. The HOA officially banned her from distributing unapproved materials. Then came the city-mandated apology. As part of the settlement to reduce the civil liability fine she owed, Karen had to issue a public statement taking full responsibility for the sabotage and apologize to every affected party. The city didn't want a generic letter mailed out either. They insisted it be a public event with documentation. Karen tried to negotiate for a pre-recorded video. The city refused. So there she was, standing in front of the HOA clubhouse, wearing a weather-inappropriate scarf, flanked by two officials and a bored cameraman. Her apology was as painful to watch as it was satisfying. She read from a wrinkled sheet of paper, voice trembling not from remorse, but from the sheer humiliation of having to admit she'd ruined community heating and endangered a daycare center because she was mad about a pool. At one point, she said geothermal as gerbil thermal and had to restart the sentence. A few of the residents chuckled. When she finished, one of the kids yelled, "Are you gonna cut more wires or are you done?" Karen's jaw locked so tight you could almost hear it. She stormed off again, red-faced and muttering, but this time no one chased her down. The apology was filmed, uploaded to the city website, and went modestly viral with the title "Local HOA President Apologizes for Freezing Her Neighborhood." With the chaos behind us, I leaned into the quiet victory. I added a small commemorative plaque to my fence post with a QR code that linked to the news article about the whole debacle. Underneath, it simply read, "Keep it warm. Keep it kind." What surprised me was how many people started adopting that message. Kids began drawing it on chalkboards, someone spray-painted it onto the community basketball court, and the daycare put it on their newsletter. It became a kind of unspoken reminder that one person's selfishness shouldn't be allowed to chill the warmth of the whole group. But Karen's personal spiral didn't stop there. Turns out, someone at the city's financial compliance department took a closer look at her past HOA project. Over the years, she had filed for reimbursements for beautification expenses that included extravagant patio furniture, a koi pond installation, and what she labeled as security enhancements that were just motion-activated sprinklers pointed at her neighbor's cat. The records were inconsistent and missing receipt. An audit was opened. By the time the HOA was informed, they had no choice but to suspend her membership entirely and freeze all reimbursements. She wasn't just unpopular now, she was broke, under investigation, and persona non grata in the community she once ruled. Meanwhile, I kept doing what I had always done: improving systems, fixing bugs, making sure the pipes stayed warm and the neighborhood stayed comfortable. I added a second emergency override switch and began talks with the city to include another nearby cul-de-sac in the geothermal network. I didn't want to just maintain the system, I wanted to grow it. And as more people saw what was possible, they started volunteering to help. One neighbor offered to build a dedicated app that monitored energy usage. Another contributed a weatherproof housing unit for the new thermal node. What started as a quiet experiment had become a community project. That, above all, was what Karen could never understand. Her world was one of control, ego, and punishment. She saw neighbors as threats, not allies. But once she was out of the way, everything bloomed. We weren't just warmer, we were connected. For the first time, kids from different ends of the street played together. Adults who had never spoken more than a wave now traded recipes and power tool advice. The pool wasn't just a pool anymore. It was the place where people gathered, where ideas sparked, where warmth, both literal and emotional, spread from the water into every conversation. It would have been poetic enough if Karen had just faded into irrelevance after her public downfall. If the story had ended with a disgraced HOA tyrant watching from behind her curtains while the rest of the neighborhood bloomed without her, that would have been more than satisfying. But karma, as it turned out, had one last encore queued up, and it wasn't done tightening the screws. Just when we all thought it was over, an anonymous tip was sent to the city auditor's office regarding Karen's time as HOA president. At first, it seemed like just another grudge-fueled complaint, maybe someone throwing an extra jab while she was down. But then receipts started surfacing, and suddenly, the sabotage of the geothermal line wasn't the only heat-related mess she was involved in. Turns out Karen hadn't just been mismanaging her duties, she had been embezzling funds from the HOA for years. What started as small, questionable reimbursements for landscape upgrades and pest control ballooned into a laundry list of fabricated expenses. There were payments listed to contractors who didn't exist, invoices for bulk garden mulch that never arrived, and a $5,800 charge for an emergency fencing restoration that looked suspiciously like the new patio wall she had installed last summer. When investigators dug deeper, they found she had even filed duplicate expenses using slightly altered invoice numbers. One neighbor joked that Karen had a PhD in creative accounting. The HOA board, now under new leadership, cooperated fully with the investigation. A full audit was conducted, and once the evidence was compiled, Karen was hit with a formal accusation of HOA fund misappropriation. She was ordered to repay over $20,000. Between that and the damages from the geothermal sabotage, her financial situation had turned from tight to critical. Word quietly spread that she had taken out a second mortgage to cover her legal fees, and a lien was placed on her house. Some speculated she might be forced to sell. Others said she was just waiting to slap a "for sale" sign on it once the heat died down, pun entirely intended. But while Karen scrambled in silence, the rest of us thrived. The upgraded geothermal system expanded its coverage, now including more than a dozen homes plus the local community center. With the app one of our neighbors built, residents could monitor their heating stats in real time and even contribute to a community pool for emergency maintenance funding. We held monthly warm nights events by the pool, where families brought snacks, played music, and enjoyed the soft glow of the mist-lit water. One evening, we even hosted a movie night using a projector on the garage wall. The film? A cheesy sci-fi flick titled The Pipe That Saved the World, selected by unanimous vote because of its unintentionally hilarious title. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. And then came the twist none of us expected. While walking my dog one morning, I noticed a familiar car parked by the entrance to the neighborhood. It was Karen's, but the plates had been removed, and a notice was taped to the window. It was an official repossession tag. Word trickled down later that week that Karen's financial obligations had finally caught up with her. She had defaulted on her settlement payments to the city and failed to meet the terms of her civil restitution plan. With her assets frozen and no remaining allies on the board, she was effectively cornered. Still, she tried one last maneuver. A desperate, final play. Karen filed a lawsuit against the HOA itself, claiming emotional distress and wrongful removal from her position. She alleged that she was being targeted by a neighborhood cult, led by me, and that the geothermal system had been a ruse to consolidate power. She tried to argue that her sabotage was an act of civil disobedience against unchecked authority. The judge wasn't amused. The case was dismissed in under 10 minutes, and Karen was ordered to pay additional court fees. If she had hoped to get sympathy, all she got was laughter. When the moving truck arrived, few people noticed. She left early in the morning, boxes stacked chaotically in the bed of the vehicle. A few curtains twitched as she loaded the last of her things, but no one said goodbye. The woman who once wielded fear like a scepter left in silence, her empire of fines, fake invoices, and HOA tyranny crumbling behind her. In her place, a quiet calm settled over the street. People seemed to walk a little slower, wave a little more often. The shadows had lifted. A few weeks after her departure, the house went up for auction. The new owners were a young couple with a toddler and a golden retriever. The first thing they did was tear down Karen's ridiculous tiki bar and replace it with a sandbox. I helped them patch up their heating lines, and within a day, they were connected to the geothermal network. As the system hummed to life and warm water filled their pipes, the mom turned to me and said, "It's like this place is breathing again." I couldn't have said it better myself. To celebrate the neighborhood's return to peace, we hosted one last poolside gathering before summer kicked into full swing. The theme? Warmth and whimsy. Someone brought tiki torches as a joke. Another neighbor made sugar cookies shaped like tiny pipes. We set up floating lanterns across the pool, each one with a note inside, a personal message about what the neighborhood meant to us now. As the lanterns drifted gently across the water, someone played acoustic guitar and kids laughed from the patio. It wasn't extravagant. It wasn't loud. But it was perfect. I stood back for a moment, watching it all. The steam from the pool drifted into the sky like a silent thank you, and I felt a deep, grounding peace. The geothermal node beneath my feet hummed steadily, a reminder that the best systems aren't just about utility, they're about connection. What Karen tried to sever had only brought us closer. Her destruction had made room for unity. Her coldness had inspired warmth. The lesson wasn't lost on anyone. Later that night, as I checked the system diagnostics from my phone, I got an alert. One of the sensors in the eastern loop had registered a slight shift. Nothing serious, probably just a squirrel, but I smiled anyway. Because, unlike before, I wasn't alone in keeping things running. We had a network now. Not just of pipes and sensors, but of people. Of trust. Of resilience. And no matter how cold the next winter would be, I knew this neighborhood would never freeze again. As I turned off the pool lights and walked back inside, I glanced once more toward the lot where Karen used to live. The porch was quiet, the new owners asleep, the lights soft and welcoming. There was no more tension, no more silent surveillance from behind curtains. Just peace. And all it had taken was a bolt cutter, a broken pipe, and a woman too entitled to understand that warmth, real warmth, isn't something you take. It's something you share.